Right. Hi, folks. I'm Thorfinn. I am out of the East Kingdom. I live in modern Manhattan. This is a talk on calling sex and gender in Norse society. This is about what do we know about gender roles? What do we know about sexual behavior? What do we know about transgression of those norms in the Viking world? I'm going to use Viking a lot, just kind of casually. I don't mean people who go out and raid. I mean like those people, but also like the people I call them Norse people. But I'm going to be sloppy about it. Sorry. Before I get started, I want to offer a content warning. This talk's going to mention sex, sexual abuse, and violence, especially violence directed at gender and sexual minorities in pretty stark terms. I'm going to try to point this out ahead of time. Much of this talk also involves religion, both Old Norse and Christian. Remember that it's always okay to leave and come back or not come back, whatever, if you need to, totally cool. I also, this is all written up with citations and things, so I will post that at the end along with my contact info. If you want to follow up, ask more questions, say, hey, you missed this. I revise this as I go. I've given this talk for a number of years now, mostly at Penzic, but I would be delighted to include more information, although I try to keep it to an hour, so there's not always room for new stuff. Okay. This idea of a Viking warrior is this like strong cultural idiom, right? Pervades medievalism, right? We see Viking people doing Viking reenacting all the time. We see it in the US, we see it in Europe, which is a whole bunch of specifically Viking groups. And it's like, it's kind of almost the only early period thing people do. If you're thinking about the time frame, call it 793 to 1066, if we're being Anglo-centric. Like very few people do reenacting, at least in my area, in that time period that isn't Viking or Norse. So it's like a big deal. This matters. We need to talk about it. In some ways, this idea of a violent, gruff raider taking riches and assaulting women reflects in our modern society as a symbol of, masculinity gone wrong. And medieval Christian writers certainly sort of agree. They want us to view these people as savage outsiders with no place in society. But we want to ask as reenactors, what did the society look like from the inside? What do we know about the expected gender roles and how they enforced? And what happened to those who deviated? So that's our topic. Most of this talk doesn't really have answers. I want you to raise questions. I want to get you thinking about this. I want you engaging with the source material and coming to your own conclusions about, what do you do about applying this to your own presentation? What do you do about, do you want to take this and think about things differently? Or just, have an interesting conversation. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk first about source material. I like to do that in Viking topics because it's so there's so little out there, and it's important to grapple with these limitations. We're going to talk about what do we know about male roles? What do we know about female roles? What do you know about maybe non-binary people, something in that direction? Being careful with terminology here because we're going to start out very gender essentialist. That's what a lot of the evidence is framed in, and then we're going to get a little bit more nuanced. Bear with me. I agree with the criticisms of this, but it's kind of the only way we can make progress. And throughout the talk, I'm going to be using my best attempt at reconstructed medieval Icelandic pronunciation following Dr. Jackson Crawford, who is now a YouTuber, but used to be a professor and lecturer at University of Colorado Boulder. Find his YouTube channel if you want to learn more about Norse language and myth. It's great. Okay, I'm going to pause at the end of every section for questions, but please, I'm very good at not getting sidetracked by questions, so ask whenever. Okay, so sources. We have effectively no writing from Viking Age Scandinavia that survives outside of, directly, outside of some fragments and some runestones. Almost everything else we have is from later. So looking at poetry, this means primarily two manuscripts, the Codex Regius from 12 to 1270s, which is probably a copy of an older manuscript from 1200, and a 14th century manuscript called Hauksbók, which both have poems in them. Some of these poems, this is the Poetic Edda, if you've seen that. Some of these poems are datable to times further in the past via historical linguistic methods. The oldest of these date to not the 900s, but they could be older, right? They could have been rewritten. They could have older ideas in them. I'm going to be using, when I have translations that I'm going to read, I'm going to be using, again, Dr. Jackson Crawford's translations in his 2015 book, Poetic Edda, because I like them. There are lots of other translations. They're not the only ones. Poems are hard to use for strong evidence because they're not literal, right? And the poems that are about stories are a second level of non-literal, right? They're about gods and heroes. They're not direct evidence about Norse life and culture. but they're instructive. They tell us what Norse society is holding up as models to aspire to or shy away from. And so that's useful, but we need to understand the limits. Additionally, later poems also have the problem of influence from the Christians writing them down or interacting with the poems over time. And even the earlier poems that we have, they're relatively late in the Viking Age. So we need to address like Christian influence there as well. And yeah, this line is dateable, but the line before and above it that aren't dateable, like this is hard. Everything is mushy. So as an example of a question here, folks familiar with Viking mythology Norse mythology might recognize Odin's sacrifice of himself to himself. He hung himself on the world tree for 9 long nights and screaming took the runes, right? This is how we have runes, this is how we have runic magic. Cool story. It kind of sounds similar in an abstract way to the sacrifice of God the Son to God the Father, right? Kind of weird. This is, of course, an extremely reductionist view of both religions, but it's possible that this story in Norse mythology is not kind of indigenous in a way, that perhaps it came about as through contact with Christians, or even after Christianization, the story was rewritten to be more similar to the Christian story. We cannot tell. We do not know. This kind of issue is something that has to be considered with any of the mythological stories. And mostly the thing you kind of do here is you kind of got to shrug and make sure that you note that you do not have confidence on a topic, because you can't really say, oh, well, we could tell. Moving on from poems, we've also got a lot of prose literature, much of it written down by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century. He's writing it down because he wants to sort of preserve this old tradition that's being looked on fondly of sagas and poetry and the specific kinds of poetry that require mythological allusions. He's also trying to build a cohesive view of Norse mythology. And this is interesting to me because all evidence points to there not being a cohesive Norse mythology, right? If you're a modern person and you're used to thinking about religion the way that modern people do, effectively every religion that we're interacting with has like a cohesive dogma, and there's like this process of deciding what is and isn't part of sort of a religious belief corpus. And this may not be like, Christianity is not one, but if you look at us, like if you look at Catholicism, right, like there's been a ton of work put in over centuries to deciding what is and is not exactly these beliefs. This is not the case for Norse mythology. This is probably not the case for many, many religions worldwide, but the ones that get big are the ones that have had these processes to refine them, right? Norse mythology, probably quite fluid. I would be shocked if people in Uppsala had the same kind of theology as people in Iceland. So that adds complexity. Snorri is trying to write in Iceland 200 years after Christianization, 300 years after Christianization. Is this perspective right? Who knows? He's certainly trying to build a cohesive idea. So grain of salt, right? There's also the world of Icelandic sagas. So these are fiction stories that aren't about gods and heroes. They're about like people. Think of these like soap operas, right? They're dramatic. They're kind of fun. A lot of them are also written by Snorri. They're not all. Same time period. They're written down in the 13th century. They're talking about often events that occurred much earlier, sometimes before Christianization. But remember that these are stories. These are not historical records, right? This is not a thing that happened. This is a cool story, bro. In the same way that you wouldn't watch telenovela from like the 1990s and go around believing that that is exactly what life in, Mexico City then was, or whatever telenovela you're watching. Our final Norse prose source are law codes. So the big one here is the Grogos, which is the Icelandic law code from the 13th century, which definitely records an earlier oral tradition. But again, you cannot tell like which bits are older. It's also not older than the 920s. And there's an Norwegian law code, set of law codes as well. There's a couple of these around. This is interesting, right? This is laws tell us a lot. We also have non-Viking sources. So folks have probably heard of, I hope you've heard of, if you haven't, enjoy. Muslim writers, Ibn Fadlan is the big one, who goes in the 920s and meets people that we're pretty sure are culturally Norse, but they're in the Volga, at least the Volga area. So this is quite far east. This is like thousands of miles. Think like, Seattle to Miami kind of distance. If you're comparing Iceland to the Volga Delta, quite far. And they're, Eastern Vikings, they're a frontier culture that may be a bit coarser and rougher. It's hard to know what that difference is. We also don't know how much influence the people that he's observing and writing down have had from other peoples. You're traveling thousands of miles through territory populated by people who are not Norse, and they have their own ideas about culture. And also we're seeing this through his lens. So there's a Christian writer who's maybe not super reliable in writing after the Viking era, who says that in England that Vikings bathe too often, and they're seducing all of the good English women because they're too clean. That may or may not be true. Don't worry about it though. Ibn Fadlan also is writing and saying these guys are gross. They're disgusting. Are these people the same people? Do they have the same habits? Like, it's entirely possible that they have the same bathing habits, but this lens of cleanliness is different from the different writers. And so when we look at something written by Ibn Fadlan, we have to include that understanding of, well, he has this perspective on what's normal, what's good, what's bad. There's a couple other Islamic writers. They mostly don't tell us that much, other than like Vikings attacked Seville. There's also some Christian authors. Adam of Bremen is the big one. So he's a priest. He's writing secondhand about like what's going on in Uppsala in particular, the description of the temple there. I haven't found a good English translation of his stuff. If you have one, I would love to know about it, especially if it's online. As far as I know, there isn't a lot of juicy material in there for this topic, so we're just gonna mostly ignore it. This is a potential hole in this talk. And then our last set of sources is archaeology. So we have a lot of grave finds. We have a lot of like finds without context, particularly rich set of finds at Birka. There's lots of other locations. These have these are interesting, right? Because like the fact of this object being here is a fact, right? You can't argue that like, no, this comb was not discovered here. Like it was. But the interpretations of those facts and to build up to more interesting things, more complex things like ideas about gender and sexuality and societal roles, that requires interpretation. And for better or worse, this excavation was almost overwhelmingly done in the 19th century by rich white dudes in Scandinavia, right? And they have their own worldview that they project onto the objects, and that starts their interpretation, right? So we're going to talk later about that Viking warrior grave that is interesting because of a reinterpretation that happened, where when this person was excavated, they said, they've got weapons. This is clearly a man. And it turns out like the interpretation is more complex than that. As a reminder, this 19th century worldview is one that is gender essentialist and erasive of queer identity. And in some ways, queer identities hadn't been developed by that. Okay, questions about sources? I'm going to give you a second. This is the boring start of the talk, but it's like important to be precise. Okay, not seeing anything. I'm going to move on. If I missed you, put it in the chat or whatever. All right, let's talk about men. And I'm gonna argue that like we can talk about men. There's clearly a distinction, but of like sort of two peaks of likelihood of clothing and societal roles and things that we're going to call men and women. This is not like, I think you're here at the DAIB thing. Like, we know that it's not just men and women, but this is what we're going to talk about because they have to have categories to talk about them. Men are clearly privileged in the Norse world. Odin and his brothers are the gods that create the world. Men are the ones who get things like voting rights. Men are more likely to be the bearers of grudges. Almost all of the gods that we talk about are gods and not goddesses. So we're going to talk about them first. So to some extent, our understanding of women in Norse society is in contrast to men. This sucks. Like, I don't like this. But this is the society we're talking about. So Vikings are canceled. I'm sorry to tell you. So we know from grave evidence, we know from lots of things, like there's clearly male expectations include female expectations. Male graves tend to have weapons and tools. Female graves tend to have jewelry and domestic equipment, on and on, right? That's not that interesting. What does it mean if you like break these rules? So initially I wanted this to be a talk about queer people in Norse culture, and it's not really directly possible to talk about this. And first of all, we just don't have enough information, right? Like there's almost nothing from the Viking Age at all anyway, never mind the fact that queer writers in the Middle Ages are themselves quite rare. There's a couple that you can be like, this person seems like they might have been a queer person if we had a modern lens. The intersection is at the empty set. There's just nothing. But more importantly, it's also ahistorical to apply modern cultural constructs like queerness to people in the past. If we labels like gay or lesbian or trans or non-binary or agender, these are labels we apply to behaviors and experiences that definitely happened in the past. But that experience of an individual is conceptualized differently in different period points in time, right? We have language now, we have ideas now, we have ways to conceptualize things that they didn't have at various points in the past. This isn't just the Viking Age. And there's probably concepts in the past that we have lost, right? I coincidentally gave the same talk earlier today, and someone brought up like this distinction between like now being gay and having sex, like being a man who has sex with men is a thing you are, but through like most of the Christian Middle Ages, that was a thing you did. In the same way that you might be like someone who goes bowling, and it's not like you're a bowler, right? So that's a big difference, right? And this is important to remember. But, and content warning, this section is going to include something that's really close to homophobia, but we have some stuff. So there's this term drengar, which means kind of like manliness. And it's got an antonym, got a couple antonyms. So I'm going to go between them. So I'm going to give you them now, how to remember. Argar, ergi, and ragar, which one definition gives as a highly pejorative adjective implying a lack of manly qualities and especially imputing to another a desire for a passive role in sex with a male. There are modern analogs of this that are pretty offensive, at least for most people. So this is interesting because this has strong parallels to kind of like a modern notion of a classic toxic male identity, and its opposite, an undesirable femme or even possibly queer identity. And we're seeing the same kind of dichotomy in Norse sources. Scholar of queerness and Viking religion, Amy Jefford Franks, provides a definition or a view of ergi, saying, as it's a similar word to queer in that its meaning relates to the pushing against boundaries, in this case, in specific relation to gender and sexuality. So I think this is really interesting. And let's dig in a little bit more. The Grogos, so this is the Icelandic law code, they bring up the legal consequences of accusing somebody of being argar. These two related words that both mean something like fucked. Saying there are 3 words if men's speech becomes so bad, which all carry the penalty of outlawry. So this is permanent banishment. Namely, that if one calls men another ragar, argar, or these synonyms. And this law establishes that this is comparable, like you are entitled to recompense at the same level as the murder of a close male family member. So calling someone argar is an insult that is so severe, it is comparable to murder. Big deal. These people, at least in the law code, are expressing this like extreme care for their notion of like sort of masculine honor and being viewed as manly. This also shows up, there's a similar insult saying that a man turns into a woman every 9th night and has born children. Shows up in Norwegian law codes and in a couple other places. This is interesting because it's also a different category from other insults that are in these law codes. It's a bigger deal. And the sexual quality seems important to the weight. And as a reminder, when we're looking at law codes, from a historical perspective, the fact that something is codified generally means that it was a thing that was happening, like that people were annoyed about it enough that they were like, "This, we have to write this down." This isn't always true, but this is broadly true, right? If you look at like sumptuary law and they're saying like poor people aren't allowed to wear pearls, that tells you like poor people are wearing pearls, at least enough that someone got annoyed about it. So this is the same kind of thing here. Like people are going around calling each other names. I'm going to skip a little bit. There's some links between, there's some other evidence for this linking between sexual honor, sexual inviolacy, or sexual dominance here in these law codes. There's also an analogy between a man being a receptive sexual partner, perhaps unwillingly, and the class of major wounds. These are like getting hurt badly enough that it's cut down to the bone. These are like equivalent injuries, which is interesting, and I think tells you how much like this is viewed as an injury, as an offense. About specifically this like receptive sexual behavior. Another angle to understand this is to look at the the Eddas, the stories of the gods, there's this poem called Lokasana where, for reasons, Loki is going and insulting all of the gods, and the gods are insulting him back. And Loki is called Argar 3 times by Odin, Thor, and Njordr. And he's called this for a really obvious reason, which is that during an earlier incident, when the gods didn't want to pay their wall contractor, Loki turns into a mare, a female horse, and seduces the contractor's horse, which prevents him from finishing the wall on time and therefore completing the contract and getting paid. And then later, Loki is pregnant with the horse, the baby horse, and gives birth to it. And this is Sleipnir. This is Odin's 8-legged horse. And apparently this is not a manly thing to have done, at least according to the gods. But meanwhile, Loki turns around and slings the same insult at a different god, Gefjun, and we don't know a lot about him. Calls him Argar. And he calls him that because I remember that boy who seduced you into his bed. That handsome boy gave you a necklace, and you opened your thighs for him. So, we got some back and forth here. I think it's kind of clear, like, the category of things that this is applying to. Loki also levels his charge at Odin. Odin is a practitioner of sader, which is one of the 4 kinds of Norse magic and an inherently feminine kind. We're going to talk a lot more about this later, but Loki says, people say that you practiced womanly magic on Samsi, the island of Samsi, dressed as a woman. You lived as a witch among the humans, and I call that an Argar way of living. This is back and forth, right? And we'll talk about Odin. In Linga Saga, there's also discussion of Odin using Seder, saying such ergi accompanies this sorcery that it was considered shameful for men to be involved in it. Therefore, this art was taught to the priestesses. The Seder that Odin is using, he's using it because he has one goal, and that is like survive Ragnarok, even though he knows that he won't. And so he's like, give me all the knowledge, give me all the power, give me everything I can get. Let's go. The Seder lets him know fate in the future, cause bad luck, and to take away or transfer to another intelligence or strength. So this is the good shit. Like, this is the magic that he needs. We see some other discussion of it in some sagas. Gisla Saga Sorsonar has an example of Seder use by a man being like a pretty bad thing and being sanctioned. This character says, Thorgrimr did the Seder, and he prepared all of the equipment in his usual way, made himself a scaffold, and he did this magically with all ergi, so the adjective form of Argar, and devilry. But the narrative is actually kind of confusing, so we can't draw 100% like, oh yes, absolutely, definitely bad, but it's clear that the author is like, yeah, this is like, woo, spooky stuff. We also don't know, again, how much of this is Christian authors being like, bad magic. Right? It could be. This could entirely be colored by this. We're going to come back to say that later. We can also look at Odin through a couple other lenses. We're going to come back to him because he's really interesting. I think of him as a strong example and proponent of toxic masculinity. He wants you to be Drengr. Why does he want that? Well, he wants to have a big army for Ragnarok. And the only way you get to Valhalla, is to die in battle. So he goes around intentionally destabilizing groups and societies. And that happens over and over again. Like, read Saga of the Volsungs, like lots of these things, right? Odin shows up and like does something that makes somebody kill somebody else, and then is like, tee, more soldiers for me. Is this a metaphor for manliness itself? Is this a metaphor for what Drengr does? Like, is stability opposed to being Drengr? After all, if there's peace, one cannot demonstrate bravery in violence. Odin also is happy to co-opt female power, magically perhaps, when it furthers his ends. He also takes pride in infidelity, right? He's going around, there's lots of stories of him bragging about his sexual conquests, and his wife is just kind of like silent and angry all the time. It's also noteworthy that we see signs of devotion to Odin in the elite of society and among raiders and men on the frontier, which I think tells you something. I'm going to pause for questions about Odin. You really can ask questions. I'm quite cool with it. Okay. So what's something?
Good to go. Keep going.
Okay. An interesting foil to Odin is Thor. especially in the poem, and I have a terrible time reading this, Horbadfliod, where they're taunting each other for reasons. And content warning, this section discusses rape. So they're taunting each other. There's an exchange that happens a couple times. That's more or less Odin saying, well, I slept with 9 women last night, stolen from their husbands. And Thor responding, oh yeah, well, I was out killing frost giants, like doing my duty. Could Thor represent an alternative notion of masculinity, one focused on simple violence rather than sexual conquest? In contrast to Odin being revered among the elite and among the sort of edges of society, Thor seems to be much more common. Place names are much more common. There's a ton of places named after Thor. Thor's hammers are ubiquitous finds. There's some suggestion that Thor may have been the god of nobility, or Odin may have been the god of nobility, whereas Thor was not. Saying Odin receives the powerful men who die in battle, while Thor receives their servants. Could this indicate a class distinction? And as a reminder, well, perhaps you don't know. Norse society is thought of as having 3 classes, and I think these are established in like the sort of foundation myths: nobles, sort of yeomen, farmers, and slaves. This poem could also be trying to tell us that Odin's excesses act to undermine his masculinity. In fact, Thor calls Odin Ragar, which is again this like Argar thing, when Odin calls him a coward. This whole exchange is really interesting. So Odin says, I was off in the east, or Odin says that he was off in the east raping women. Meanwhile, I'm going to quote here, Thor said, I was fighting berserkers' brides on the island Hlessi. They had done evil things, assaulted everyone. Odin said, how shameful of you, Thor, fighting women. So they're both trying to like get at each other and say like, you're doing your gender wrong. You're being too like raping people, and the other is saying, oh, how can you fight women? That's not manly, right? Like this kind of thing. They're both trying to get into each other's skin, and it tells us a lot about conceptions of masculinity and what's good and what's bad. Another really interesting story about Thor, and we'll cover this in a little bit more later, but is in Thrymskvida, which is a poem where the plot is that this giant, and again, giants are just like anti-gods, they're like a rival family of gods, steals Thor's hammer, and to get it back, he demands to marry Frøya, and Frøya says no. And Loki comes up with a cunning plan. He also might be why the hammer got stolen. That, oh, well, we'll just dress up Thor as Frøya and send him to the wedding, and then he'll get the hammer back and kill all the giants. So Thor says, like, that would be Argar, right? For me to cross-dress. He doesn't want to do it, but he does it anyway. And they get the hammer back. It's a really fun read. You should go find it if you haven't read it, because it's got some like mwah moments. Like Thor eating a whole cow, and the giant being like, "Oh my Frøya, what big appetite you have!" It's a really fun. And this is also one of the poems we can date linguistically. So this is older than 975, we think. So it's something from the Viking Age. That's really cool. And it tells us a lot about like cross-dressing is definitely something that's pretty uncomfortable. And the kind of masculinity that Thor represents is able to recognize that, acknowledge it, and push through. So what about the repercussions for Argar? And content warning, this section discusses violence directed at sexual and gender minorities. So we see it being used as an insult. We see the importance of sexual dominance. We don't have a Viking era reference to what happens to people actually believed to be Argar, other than there's some things about like maybe you can divorce somebody for stuff like cross-dressing. We'll mention that again. But if we look around a little bit broader, we broaden our scope. We have Tacitus, who sucks. He's a Roman writer. He's bad. But he's writing about the earlier but related Germanic culture. And he suggests that people insufficiently masculine were ritually murdered. But also Tacitus, he's writing secondhand. He might actually just be meaning that he wishes that Rome did this with their like femme men. Tacitus is bad. So we don't really know what to do with this. It's possible. There's another example. It's kind of mysterious, from the story of Hagbard and Signy, where Hagbard cross-dresses in order to get access to his love's chambers. but like it's unclear because like maybe we're supposed to be like, yeah, I get it, like cool, how clever, but then he's hanged afterwards. Short, like so it I don't know. And as I mentioned, there's examples in Laxdala saga of this like weird love quadrangle where these two married couples, like they want the husband of one couple and the wife of the other couple, they want to get together. So the wife makes her husband a shirt with a scandalously low cut neckline. And that's cross-dressing because that tells us like shirts are really gender marked. I should probably not be wearing this, but if I want to not be transgressing gender roles, but also I don't really care, and I'm tired. So that's interesting, and that tells us like, okay, well, divorce is a possible consequence of not being sufficiently masculine. We also see kind of the reverse where the man accuses his wife of wearing pants, and that's also bad in this context. This is actually useful because if you're working in a Norse presentation, you might use this to decide, do you want to have if you're masculine, a high and tight neckline to conform to gender roles? Do you want to push that boundary and have like a nice low cut neckline and be like, look at my collarbones, look at my chest hair? Like maybe you have a femme presentation and you're like, do I wear pants? Like this is an interesting question, and you have a little bit of information to go with. There's also an example of Ragnvaldr, who's one of the sons of Harald Finehair, who's the first king of unified Norway, saying he practiced seidr with 80 other save men. And remember, seidr is this feminine magic, this feminized magic. And as a result, his half-brother, Eric Bloodaxe, is sent to kill him by their dad. So that seems bad. This is not like something that's easy to do and get away with in society, at least at a large scale. So then, how do you be Drengr and ward off accusations to the contrary? So there's lots of stories of martial prowess and bravery and upholding oaths even if they're stupid. But there might also be an element of performative sexual dominance here, and content warning discussions of rape. Ibn Fadlan describes a scene, and I'm going to paraphrase it, that where each man has sex with his slave on a raised platform while his companions look on. So could this indicate a societal value in like being seen doing penetrative sex? Maybe. Maybe this is a way to demonstrate how Drengr you are in society. We see this kind of thing attested by some other Muslim writers. And if we go back to Horbazli Odin, we see, talking about how much raping he's doing. So maybe. I think this is an interesting lead, but it's altogether a little unclear. We're going to move on to women next. I'm going to pause again for questions. Okay. So talking about women, one of the really interesting things in Volaspor, so this is kind of the like Viking equivalent of the story of Genesis. It's the first thing in the Codex Regius book. It's the story of the creation and destruction of the world. It's an account of Volva, who's a seeress, to Odin on the creation and destruction of the world. And this immediately centers female spirituality in the Norse world. We've also got Erdr at her well. This is kind of the equivalent of the Fates. And there's two other Norns that are with her. We don't know their names. And we also see the introduction of Heiðr in Volaspor, who's an evil Volva. She's the first being to be murdered 3 times, overachiever. So we've got this notion that like magic and spirituality in women are like kind of intrinsically linked. We've also got some more information about seidr. So we've got some negative, it's less negative when women do it. It might have still some negative connotations. Loki calls Freya, and Freya is a big seidr user. Loki calls her a witch. But it could also have to do with like the fact that the Vanir family of gods that Freya is part of has lower status. Maybe because of seidr. Maybe because seidr and sexual deviancy are inextricable here. Maybe not. We learned that seidr was first introduced to the Aesir. This is the like primary family of gods, Odin's family, by either Freya or Heiðr. And indeed, there seems to be kind of a strong association with predictive magic in women in Germanic societies. If we go back to Tacitus again, who is a problem, but he's backed up by Caesar in this case. They both write that Germanic women 1,000 years before the Viking Age play a respected clairvoyant role during battles or before battles. So that's really interesting because it seems like the same kind of thing. There's also some notable non-mythical women who used saga, like Queen Ota. And there may be a link between saga, or at least this establishment of women as like spiritual leaders, and this interesting practice of women often becoming abbesses in post-Christianization parts of Europe that had been Germanic. And this happens for about 100 to 200 years after Christianization pretty consistently. But of course, these timelines don't overlap. So you'll get like, Southern Germany Christianizing. And then 100 years later, the Pope is like, oh my God, woman, what are you doing? Absolutely no. And then sometime later, like England Christianizes and the same thing happens. And then Scandinavia Christianizes and the same thing happens. So that's really interesting. And I think tells us that there's this really deep root of female spirituality, perhaps tied to saga, perhaps tied to something else. In contrast with maybe this one notion of what like femininity could be in our society, we also have the Valkyriar, the Valkyries, who portray a very different image of Norse womanhood. And this also seems pretty common. If you look at sort of prototypical Norse female names like Gunhildr, what does that mean? Battle, battle, right? There's tons of Norse female names that are like violent, eagle, bear, that kind of thing, right? So this seems culturally relevant. We see these images all over the place. They're on gold foils, they're on pendants, they're on all sorts of art. So does that mean that there's at least some Viking women who identify with the image of a Valkyrie? Probably. Even so, some depictions of Valkyries still seem to center traditionally female actions such as weaving, but in a violent context. So consider the poem Dara Darliod, and I'll read you a couple of translations or a couple of paragraphs translated. Blood rains from the cloudy web on the broad loom of slaughter. The web of man, gray as armor, is now being woven. The Valkyries will cross it with a crimson weft. The warp is made of human entrails. Human heads are used as loom weights. The heddle rods are blood-wet spears. The shafts are iron-bound, and arrows are the shuttles. With swords, we will weave this web of battle. I love this poem. This is a description of a warp-weighted loom, but a really gross one. And I think it really shows this inextricability of traditional feminine roles in Norse society, weaving, right, textile production, from like even Valkyries, who are perhaps like this icon that's very far from a traditional feminine role. We also have a notion of, well, what if a woman is called Adger? It seems to mean something like shameful nymphomania rather than being too feminine, although maybe that is too feminine. It shows up in a couple of contexts. And it's clear that like feminine sexuality isn't just a negative for men. Women can overdo it. Looking at dress and weapons, Ibn Fadlan notes that women wear jewelry, and in doing so carry the wealth of their man. Again, this is vulgar ruse, so maybe not general. Although I think this is broadly backed up by grave finds in the rest of Scandinavia and so on. Well, does the absence of jewelry on men indicate a taboo? Possibly. What does it mean if a woman doesn't wear the jewelry? In Thrymskvida, so this is Thor goes and pretends to be a bride, we get a picture of some gender-marked items of clothing because we get this really nice description of the wedding dress, the wedding outfit. So they put a wedding dress on Thor. They put the Brisinga necklace, this is Freya's magic necklace, on his neck. They put a chain of jingling keys at his belt. They draped a woman's dress down to his knees. They placed jewels on his chest. They wrapped a pretty headdress around his head. So this is interesting to me because, I mean, this is describing a wedding outfit, but it's also like, these are probably very strongly gender marked things. We're probably supposed to laugh at this. We're probably supposed to laugh at like how awkward Thor must feel and how exposed he must feel, and like, oh, like how funny that this big masculine manly guy has to dress up as a lady. So these are probably elements that are sort of marked as feminine in their culture. Keys jump out to me, right? The headdress, the dress, these kinds of things. In the Grogas, we have some legal consequences for cross-dressing. If, in order to be different, a woman dresses in men's clothes or cuts her hair short or carries weapons, the penalty for that is lesser outlawry. The same is prescribed for men if they dress in women's clothing. So that's a big deal. That's a really, you are not going to be doing this. We talked about Laxdala saga. We have cross-dressing in both directions being grounds for divorce. But this gets complicated because we have evidence that goes against this too. So we discussed the Valkyries, and now we're going to go into a couple examples of people who have sort of mixed presentations that we have evidence of. So one of them is that Viking warrior grave from Burka. So this is a person who had 2 X chromosomes. They seem to have gone through puberty with mostly estrogen, but they're buried with typologically male grave goods. So they've got swords, spears, shields, but not necklaces, turtle brooches, or keys. And there's other graves like this too. In the 19th century, archaeologists weren't really paying that close attention. They're like, cool, it's got a sword. This must be a dude. This particular grave, this has been talked about at length, so I'm going to give you the short version. You can go find it if you want. This is grave 581, if you know the numbers. So this is a person who was buried as a warrior and a strategist, and that's pretty uncontroversial. They're buried with war gear of excellent quality, intended for someone of high social standing, gaming implements, other elements that are also, they're buried with a horse, I think, right? There's people arguing all sorts of different directions on this. I think it's worth engaging with them and asking this question of, well, like, what does this person tell us? It's possible that this is sort of a person who was feminine their whole life, but got buried just in this context for some reason. The paper calls it the straight to Valhalla option from the Burka funeral directors. But even that's like an interesting choice, right? There's some other examples of people doing both, sort of women doing weapon things. There's a statue of a warrior woman with a sword, which is notable because Valkyries pretty consistently have spears. There's some other sources that mention warrior women. There's one in the 13th century Gesta Danorum, which is the history of the Danes. There's also several saga characters who wear men's clothing for some reason, or wield weapons and do violence, particularly saga the Volsungs. So Brunhilde is the prototypical shield maiden. She's a former Valkyrie, and she looks like a man with her helmet on. Like it says that. There's also the saga of Hervor and Hedrek, where Hervor, who's a woman, sort of grows up kind of tomboyish, trains in combat. It does a lot of stuff. It's a great story, and then takes on a male persona for a while to do like violence, because that's what she wants to do. She wants to do violence. She even like keeps us up while she's in the court of a king, and it's kind of an open secret what's up, but yeah, it's fine. And then later she returns to a traditionally feminine life. So it ends with, then Hervor spent a long time in warfare and raiding and had great success. And when she tired of that, she returned home to the Jarl, her mother's father. From then on, she went along like other girls, weaving and doing embroidery. So that's really interesting. It tells us something about, can you cross these boundaries multiple times? Is that expected? Is it maybe okay to have like a wild fling with transgressing gender norms, as long as you settle down eventually? There's some evidence in that other direction. Maybe that god Gefjun was like, a youthful fling of somebody's. The other thing from these stories is that these people aren't sanctioned, right? They're not sentenced to outlawry. So what's up with that? We have these law codes that seem pretty straightforward, and these stories that don't match them at all. I think that like the conclusion to draw here is that the laws are not ironclad, that this stuff is probably contextual. It might be class marked, it might be something else. It might be that the laws are later additions to the law codes. Maybe that's a Christian influence. Like, this is interesting. There seems to be a lot more space in the stories for gender transgression than there is in the law codes. Another important thing to note here is that we can't answer how these people felt of themselves, right? They're dead, which sucks, but like we can't ask them. And even if we could ask them, it would take a while to explain like what are our concepts of gender and sexuality and identity, because these people are not living with them. right? You can't go take a class in queer theory at University of Uppsala because it doesn't exist in 972 or whatever, right? So how they're interpreting their experiences can be different. I think it's unfair to go and say, oh, this is a trans man. Certainly this person had some experiences that probably align with that identity and some that probably don't. And that's about all we can say. I'm going to pause there. We're going to move on to sort of more speculative stuff, pushing beyond binaries next, but questions about women. Hi, Fiona.
Hi. When we've been talking about men, you have a lot of examples of like sexual relationships between two men, but like, do we see a lot of stuff between two women, or is that even written about at all?
I actually think that there isn't a lot of examples of sexual relationships between two men in the stuff I'm talking about, other than that, like couple of god things.
Okay.
The doing saga, it requires bottoming to do the magic. This is quite clear about that, but it's not clear that that's
Mm.
a sexual relationship, and it's not even clear whether it requires a person to be the other partner. It might, like, objects might work. So I don't actually see very many examples of sexual relationships that might, let's call them homosexual relationships, in either direction, other than, I mean, Loki shapeshifting and this accusation of Gefyon. There might be some that I've missed. I didn't go looking for them specifically to prepare this, so it's possible there's some that I've missed. I'm a SCADEIB who's interested in this. I'm not a professional scholar. And then it's an interesting question. So I think there's actually just really not a lot of examples at all.
Mm. Okay, yeah.
We also don't see a lot of discussion of sex as sex in Norse myth in general. So we see like people are married, people have kids, and then we see stuff like Odin being like, oh yeah, I totally raped that lady, but we don't see like a discussion of the sexual relationship in general.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and Jennifer's comment there as well, that I'm going to read out because it maybe it won't make it into the video. I don't know. That, like, yeah, in many male-dominated societies, sex between women and women wasn't really considered real sex. I don't know if that's the case here. I would be unsurprised if it was. Spencer.
Yeah, so it's interesting that we see like such an important religious symbolism of like women as warriors. And then it was illegal for them to bear weapons. Obviously,
Maybe.
bearing weapons in a civilian context is very different than like being part of a military campaign or like a raider. But like, is there evidence for women besides, the example of the woman who went as a man? Are there examples of women as women, serving in military campaigns, etc.?
I bet there are. I bet there's a few, but I don't really know. There's probably a description of like a Viking raiding party or something that
Yeah,
might have
I know
women in
there's like
it.
the shield maiden trope.
Yeah, I feel like the shield maiden trope is probably more just a poetic term than it is
Yeah,
like a thing. Like, I think it just means women going fighting. I don't think it
yeah.
means like shieldy. You can look at Saga of the Volsungs as well and talk about Brunhilde, but that's kind of weird also because she's a Valkyrie.
Okay,
So,
interesting.
question mark. All right, let's move on. I want to finish this last section before we hit half past. So there's a really cool master's thesis. Yes, this might be, we'll talk about intersex, maybe intersex people. Again, hard to say from the evidence we have. We'll talk about that in just a moment. There's a really interesting master's thesis by Megan Callahan titled Magic Beyond the Binary, Magic and Gender in the Poetic Edda that has some interesting insights or opinions, depending on when you view it. So far I've talked mostly about like these two gender roles, male and female, because you kind of have to. But by the same token, we could look at these transgressions and those who welcome them, and particularly Loki, but also to some extent Odin, as representing positions between or outside binary genders. Perhaps Loki revels in accusations of Arger because he exists outside of the social norms that bind him to masculinity. I mean, he's a literal shapeshifter. So not just between male and female, but also into a falcon, a salmon, a mare, and it keeps going. Loki defies being fixed by form or expression or gender expression and represents transgression itself in many ways. He's both impregnated as a man, he's been impregnated as a woman or as a female horse, and also has been impregnated as a man by eating the heart of a witch and giving birth to witches, which is apparently a thing that happens. Use protection when you eat the heart of a witch. One of Loki's children is half alive and half dead. So maybe this male aspect of Loki could represent something that we might look at now and say, oh, well, that's a third gender, or something that may be gender fluid. In Norse society, it's possible. It's hard to know, but it's possible. It's interesting to note that in many Loki stories, he causes chaos and then puts it right again. Maybe this is an example. Maybe this means that like this return to masculine nature is inevitable. Does this align with the like Hervor story about like going back to being sort of a traditional woman? What does it mean that Loki is bound in his male form until Ragnarok by the body of his son? Like, that's pretty metal. That seems like it's a metaphor for something. What do we make it of that? The fact that Loki is the only one who's doing this so flagrantly, so comfortably, so much transgression, and is an outcast. And how does he contrast with Odin, who's his blood brother, who transgresses but retains status and masculinity? And then another consideration is that maybe Loki's story has been embellished and made more negative in order to draw an analogy with the devil in Christian mythology. Like, we can't really tell. It's possible. Seder too is really interesting because its origins are potentially from multiple marginalized directions, not just women, not just like the kind of homosexual bottoming aspect, but so like maybe you have to have less masculinity to use it, but also it might originate from the shamanistic magic of the Sami people, which is interesting. There's notions around this that maybe the Vanir gods are related to them. Maybe that's why they're lower status. Maybe that's why it has negative connotations. Note that Odin also shapeshifts. Is he also transgressive, but to a lesser degree? We know that Odin uses Seder, but he still remains a masculine icon. Maybe this is because most of his magic is other kinds. Is this an intentional choice by later scribes to normalize Odin into a Christian mold? But on the other hand, is it possible, is it possible that Viking era Norse society was far more open to gender nonconformity than we are led to believe by the sources we have, filtered as they are through Christian hands? Recent scholarship, particularly by Amy Jefford Franks, presents a much more complex view of Odin's gender itself, going so far, they suggest that his existence is in both male and female aspects. This tension between the masculine warrior god and the Adga save user is this tension. And they argue that this tension is only resolvable through a queer perspective. Going back to Hobosliod, one reading is not like, oh, this is just masculine sexual exploit of women, but maybe Thor's charge against Odin is actually that Odin is not only being like an inappropriate too feminine man, but that he's doing womanhood wrong. Maybe that he's being too promiscuous and using feminine magic, and like that's a bad thing to do as a woman. It's possible. I think this is a little bit more of a stretch, but it's an interesting interpretation. We know that one of Odin's many names is gelding, a castrated male horse. There's a figure called the Lyra chair. That's a tiny little silver figurine that's clearly Odin and is clearly dressed in a dress, in a woman's outfit. Could this be him doing Seder? Franks cast Odin as a mediator of a mixed gender space in Valhalla, whose queerness is necessary to draw the feminine Valkyries and the masculine dead together. So that's interesting. There are other grave examples of mixed presentations. We talked about the one from Burka. There's another find from Gerdrup with a needle box and a spear. There's some Norwegian graves with overbrooches and weapons, often axes. These could be jumbles, some of them. They could just be mixed up from bad storage or from like, stuff falling around. But they could not be, right? Like, and if we look further afield in Friesland or the British Isles, and again, I'll link my material here so you can go through my citations and stuff if you want more detail. We find migration era graves with like archaeologist assigned men, I'm going to call them that, and female marked grave goods. So, we don't really know, right? We don't know what these people would have thought about themselves. We don't know what they would have thought about the modern lens either, but there are clearly people with experiences that are not just like, yup, check box, male, female, right? So I want to end with a talk. I want to end this talk with a quote from the Gestes Honorum, History of the Danes, to remind us to broaden the space we allow for our interpretations of gender roles and expression when we look at the past. There were, in days of yore among the Danes, women who changed their female beauty into male being and devoted most of their time to martial arts, so that the disease of exuberance should not dull their courage. For they hated all kinds of voluptuous lifestyle and hardened body and soul continuously by the means of endurance and exertion, and thus giving up all female weakness, forced their souls to achieve male cruelty, and they were so keen on warfare that you might think that they were no longer women. Mostly, they were women with strong souls or slim, tall figures who chose that way of life, as if they forgot the traditions into which they were born and preferred harshness instead of soft words, battle instead of caress, thirsted after blood instead of kisses, practiced the art of war instead of the art of love, and held spears in those hands which should have been occupied by weaving. And they did not think about the marriage bed, but death, and attacked with sharp weapons the men whom they could have pleased with their beauty. So thank you. I'm going to stay open for questions for as long as we have the room. And going to drop some links. So you can read the notes that I'm reading from here at this link. There's a link to a Google Doc within that. And that has citations. I've tried to be as scholarly as I can muster on this, although I am not a professional scholar. And you can email me at this thing that I'm going to type. Yeah, that's my email. So you can email me there and questions. Things you want to talk about. I don't think that anyone's in this room after this, so.
Very red right now. I've got a question.
Yeah.
This has also been really great as a reiteration of a lot of stuff because I read the book, The Children of Ash and Elm, and
I have heard of it, but I have not read it.
okay. It's definitely worth it's a fantastic read just as like a Viking world as a whole, but there's a whole chapter on like gender and sexuality, and it actually covers a lot like what you've talked about as well. Just to solidify in essence what you've talked about there. I've also heard, I think from a friend of mine who's been doing some research on stuff of sometimes if you had like a family, but you didn't have like an eldest son, or maybe you only had daughters, that sometimes the eldest daughter would assume the role of the eldest son, if you've come across that at all.
There's a reference to something like there's actually a little bit of this in my notes that I skip it strategically to deal with time because that's what giving a talk that has a fixed timeline requires. There's a little bit of something around like maybe women were allowed to do male things if like, you know, your husband died, then the wife could go vote, could carry a grudge, could do these things until they like remarried or until their eldest son was of age. I don't know, like I don't want to go so far as being like, oh, this is something like there's a modern society in the Balkans somewhere where sometimes people assigned female at birth do this, like take on the male role to the extent of like marrying a woman. Do not go that far. This evidence does not support this. It is of course possible, but like I'm trying to be evidence-based here and give you like, here's what we can say. I don't think it goes that far. There is some evidence of like, and I have people doing things, and that kind of makes sense, right? Because like these societies are not that big. There's more Scadians than there were medieval Icelanders. Like these are not big societies. So like, yeah, you have, you know, these legal needs and you have the other things, and it probably adds complexity to stuff, but you're not going to just be like propertyless as a woman because you're like high status, well-regarded husband as in the society. This is also probably different for people who are not being written about. You know, thinking about class, is that like, if you're a slave, it's going to be real different, probably. If you're a yeoman farmer, it's probably going to be real different than if you're a noble. Yeah, I mean, legal for rich people is like, you're all medievalists. Like, good luck finding out about peasants. It's real hard. You have to put a lot of work into that.
I've got another question.
Yeah, I'm here. Other people can ask
Um,
too. Like, please, I invite you all.
yeah. Tacitus and
Oh, the worst.
one, what's your beef with him?
Oh, he's the
Uh,
worst. He's like, we should kill queer people.
oh yeah, true.
Like, that's pretty bad.
Yeah.
Although to be
Um,
honest, I kind of forget why I put so much hate for Tacitus in these notes.
he's also a Roman author and being
Yeah.
all like, oh God, the barbarians and stuff like
Yeah.
that too. But I know that I've come across, I guess there's like some bog burials throughout sort of Northern Europe, and I think there's a couple of a lot of the bog burials in particular, like these people have met a very violent
Yeah.
end, and some of it's all like, oh, they could have murdered somebody or like they were outcast in society. But I think it's from Tacitus potentially of being like, oh, like you're actually pinning the body down in the bog so they
Gross.
can't like get out of the bog really. And
I,
I don't know if we
yeah,
have those sorts of burials like in Scandinavia
we
though.
don't. We don't
Okay.
have bog burials stopped during the migration era.
Okay.
Which as a costume person, I hate. I'm so bad about it. I just
Same.
wanted to excavate a fully costumed person. Like, please go back in time and push people into bogs. I just want to see
Yeah.
their clothing. That they stop. So this is that I think stops around 400 or 500. Probably is a little bit inconsistent. If you want to go look at sources on this, Danish textiles from bogs and burials,
Okay, yeah.
I think is the book on this, for at least for Denmark, and they like definitely stopped. So if these were like, I would believe that bog burials are could be ritual murders. I would not believe Tacitus alone saying that these are ritual murders of queer people or approximately queer people, whatever we want to do with this. I think we just don't know. And I think it would be kind of dangerous to go that far.
I have an economics question.
That's rough. This is a queer theory class, but okay.
So we know that certain professions, I will call them, but that might be the wrong word, like weaving and brewing, etc., were exclusively performed by women. Um, I know that in some other societies like Egypt, they had like gender roles are very stratified. And a family's profession, like let's say you're in a family of tailors and that's what you guys do. Often it'll be like the woman who actually does the tailoring and the man just kind of like carries things around. So it's the skilled labor, as you would say from a modern perspective, the economic output is largely coming from like the woman's skill. And then obviously different societies treat the value of that labor differently. So I'm just wondering if like was there like a lot of respect given to like female craftspeople of the era, or was it kind of more like just labor that was extracted?
This is a good question, but it's the one that's a little hard to answer. So
Yeah.
it's an important thing to remember. This is now broad strokes Viking society, not particularly this class content. It's important to remember that Norse society, particularly pre-Christianization, is not urbanized
Yeah.
pretty much exclusively. So your economic units are farmsteads, and these might be farmsteads of even up to 50 people or even 100 people, but you're not looking at urban centers. You have relatively little specialization. And most people are like producing textiles for their farmstead. Maybe they're having their slaves do it, maybe they're doing it themselves, maybe like the owner of the farmstead, the woman owner is doing maybe the high quality textile work or high skill textile work, maybe not. But this is not a society that's really stratified compared to like later European society that has this enormous comparative degree of economic prosperity.
Mhm.
And you're really just doing a homesteading, maybe big homesteading. So to the extent that you get textile production for trade, and you do, right? You get stuff like the trade Varafelder, the trade cloaks from Iceland, and you probably get some other stuff from other places. And there's probably lots of economic activity going on here that we just don't have records of. Like that's like incidental to the primary economic production of
Yeah.
farming. So I think we just don't know. I assume that women were respected for high quality work sometimes and probably not others.
I have a thing to add to that, personally. Who is it? Oh, I know that she's a professor at one of the institutions on like the Eastern Seaboard. Anyways, it's Michelle Smith, maybe. But she's done a lot of work in Iceland. And she's been also working the textiles there in particular. And I think she's got like a couple of articles on how clothing was used as currency. And how there's like a whole standardization of cloth. But that can like aid in your economic discussion.
Yeah, this seems to be a book, The Valkyries Loom by Michelle Smith.
Yes.
I have
And I
not read
think
it,
her
but it is on the
husband
list.
has also uh he's been like in charge of a bunch of excavations in Iceland as well. So the two of them are like a power couple really within Icelandic archaeology.
So this looks like, at least in the abstract of the book, this will probably dig into your question, Spencer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in regards of who's profiting from this work, it sounds like the rich people. Whether
I mean,
that's
yeah.
the man or the woman of the homestead.
All right. If there are no more questions, I'm going to recommend that folks pop into and listen respectfully in the gender diverse panel in Classroom 5. There's also going on the tail end of Learning to be a Better Ally, and 2 classes that just started, Romani within the SCA period in Classroom 1, and Digital Accessibility in SCA in Classroom 3. I didn't mention Learning to be a Better Allies in Classroom 4. So I'm going to Classroom 5. So thanks for listening, folks. Hope you had a good time.
Thank you.